My name is Vida Johnson. I'm an associate professor of law at Georgetown Law, where I teach the criminal justice clinic. And for years, I was a public defender before I started teaching.
Well, thank you for joining us again. This is the third article we're talking about with you, and this is the White Supremacy from the Bench, an article you just published. And I'd love for you to begin by telling us how you came to this topic and what you found most enlightening or what surprised you the most when you wrote it.
Yeah, thank you first off for inviting me and for being interested in this and for giving me the opportunity to talk with your listeners about my work. So this article was inspired by my many years as a public defender here in Washington, D.C. And as all of your listeners would probably agree, the criminal legal system has exhibited some signs of racial bias. And as a public defender, I never really had a chance to sit down and think about these issues. But, as a public defender and as a repeat player in the criminal legal system, we always heard stories about judges saying and doing things that wasn't anyone's imagination of what a judge was. So the sort of lore in our courthouse was there was a white judge who told a Black attorney who was actually a prosecutor to smile during a power outage, or maybe it wasn't a power outage. The lights had gone out because I think the air conditioning had gone out. So they turned off the lights to make it cooler in there. And the white judge had said to the Black attorney, smile so we can see, which is a old, racist trope about the brightness of Black people's teeth compared to their skin. And ended up the Washington Post had a little write-up about it. It was before I was even a lawyer, but that judge was still around. And so it was just one of those things that was percolating in my mind, because when I was in law school, I really believed that judges were like your smartest law professor. But even better, because they were going to be neutral and they were going to be fair, and they were just going to be these pillars of wisdom that everyone could trust and rely on. And so once I was a public defender and discovered that wasn't the case, it was one of these articles I had percolating inside me, but never really had a chance to sit down and research and think about. And I've always spent my time in the criminal courtrooms here in DC, but when I started to think about it, judges have an enormous role in the lives of ordinary Americans, but particularly poor people. But if you think about it, not just the criminal cases, but people go to family court because their marriages are ending or they need to revisit the custody of their children or grandchildren. They might be facing eviction. There might be a civil lawsuit, a small claims court case, probate if a family member dies, a name change, a wedding, jury service. There's all these ways in which everyone ends up in a courthouse at some point in their lives. And so I wanted to sort of zoom out and think about what judges and what I could kind of make of judges, these racial biases that I knew existed amongst judges, but not just in the criminal legal system, also in other courtrooms. Because when people have problems, and particularly when poor people have problems, they end up in court to resolve those problems. And who gets the final say? Who gets to decide what happens to those people? Judges. And so that's sort of what inspired this article.
Yeah, and I really like how you structured the article, and the first part is kind of the business of judging and what judges do. And one of the things that I think in popular consciousness, there's this idea that judges are fair and unbiased and all, as you were saying. But I think one of the things that is not known, and I'd like you to kind of address this, is just how much power the judge has in that courtroom and how that power is then viewed as unbiased and beneficial to those who society, and that whole kind of construct of the judge in the courtroom.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating too. Like if if you've been in court, even for jury duty, you know that like everyone stands up when the judge enters the room. It's like a remnant of like, I don't know, some like royal family, right? Like we call judges Your Honor. You're not allowed to talk to them like they're normal people. And they literally sit on high, right? And look down at us, which, I get it. Like we have to give, we all want to believe that judges can make these decisions, because it's really hard to imagine a system that doesn't have a legal system. And so you want to believe that there's someone with the wisdom and the knowledge and the ability to make a decision about what's right, how to judge another person or another act or a dispute. Like that's a thing that we all kind of hope you know exists there to solve problems. And but it's also a problem because they carry so much power and their decisions carry so much weight that everyone laughs at their jokes. Very few people tell them that they're wrong. Even if someone takes an appeal, it goes to who? Other judges, right? And so these other judges who they hang out in the same dining room with, or they go to the same judicial conferences, they may live in the same neighborhoods. So it's very rare that a judge finds that another judge has made a mistake. And that, I think, unfortunately, I think it would happen to any of us, myself included, if everyone told me I was right all the time, that I was super charming and funny all the time, that everything I did was right, you would start to think that you were infallible and that you didn't have to think through your decisions. And I think, unfortunately, that's what can happen to some judges. I think the vast majority of judges probably try really hard to make their decisions, but it's not all of judges. And given the number of cases that come before judges in our legal system, it's truly millions a day. When you think about all the courts in every city, in every state, and we have a whole federal system on top of that, it's a lot of things that get decided by judges every single day in the United States. And there's this legal doctrine of judicial deference that means that most legal decisions are unreviewable. And so there really are very few instances in which judges get told that they're wrong about anything. And they literally have people in their courtrooms who are there to make sure that no one does. I mean, right, in DC, we have US Marshals in the courtrooms who are basically what might be called bailiffs or sheriff's deputies in other courtrooms. But these folks that are armed and physically intimidating. And so even a litigant isn't going to tell a judge you're wrong, at least not very often.
Well, yeah, that's so interesting in the interpersonal interactions of the courtroom and how it's designed and that sort of thing. But then there's also as you touched on with the appellate, it's incredibly hard to hold a judge who's misbehaved or done something that is like the example you gave at the beginning about the racist comment. What process is there even to hold that judge accountable professionally and, within because I mean, the person who would probably be bringing it would be a defendant anyway, or probably not a prosecutor, right? So how do judges get disciplined and how are they held accountable?
That's a great question. And the fact that you don't know is a real failure of our whole legal system and civics, because I did not know how we did it in most states. And I've been to law school and I teach in a law school, but it is very hard to hold a judge accountable. So most states have a disciplinary body that can take up issues of misconduct with judges. But the procedure to lodge those complaints is extremely opaque and difficult. So it's not like, those trucks where there'll be a bumper sticker on the back, like, how am I driving? Please call this number. That doesn't exist in a courthouse. There should be a sign behind every judge, like, please report issues of misconduct at this number or this website, but that does not exist. And it's in fact very difficult. And there's tons of disincentives to making a report about a judge who does something, whether it's illegal or just offensive. It's really difficult. So I'll give you an example. Let's say I'm that prosecutor who had that statement made to him. He appears in front of that judge every day. And so it would take a lot of bravery, a lot of strength, and support from his supervisors to even consider lodging a complaint against him. And the vast majority of complaints aren't sustained. Let's take an example of someone who isn't a prosecutor, who isn't someone who whose word is trusted by people in the legal system. Let's say you're just a pro se litigant, a person who's in court, maybe in a eviction case or a small claims court case where you don't have a lawyer. You wouldn't even know where to begin. It would be so difficult to make a complaint against a judge, even if you were able to Google it and figure it out. You then have to have it documented somehow. So you've got to go on record, you've got to give your name and your address, and you have to swear in most states that what you allege took place. And then these disciplinary bodies are going to weigh who they believe. This pro se litigant who has very little legal training, if any, and maybe isn't the most polished or professional person, or this judge who wields a ton of power and who everyone relies on and who people think of as fair. So it's really difficult to imagine a scenario that isn't like on tape, where a judge is going to end up being disciplined, because you have a ton of instances where no one wants to lodge a complaint because they're repeat players in that system. Or you're going to be talking about people with very little social capital, very little power, who just aren't going to feel like they're the person who can lodge a complaint against a judge. They're just not going to think anyone would believe them, or just think, who am I? No one's going to care what happened to me. And so there's just not a real system to hold judges accountable, unfortunately.
And additionally, you make the point in the article that the judges determine what is fact. So
Right.
in that courtroom, they're the arbiter, they're the final say on what can be allowed, what can be brought in, what can be talked about, and then what is the fact of the case. So, there's which then leads us into this bias and what you kind of provocatively say, that judges are the enforcers of our structural racism and our white supremacy. So let's kind of make that leap from
Sure.
across that chasm to get to that bias and white supremacy.
Yeah. So I first want to say it brings me no great pleasure to make those connections. The more I thought about it, the kind of sadder I got, because we often think of judges as the ones who have created these societal rules that seem fair to us. Like, I'll give you the example of Loving versus Virginia, which was the Supreme Court case that said that people of different races could marry, and that states couldn't say that that's not okay. Or Brown versus Education, that schools had to be integrated for our system to be fair, right? So we think of courts as the places where we can go to get racial justice. But unfortunately, that just hasn't been true all that often in history, and that those are great examples of when things have worked well, but usually the opposite is the case. And there's tons of great literature out there just about poor people's courts generally and how difficult they are to achieve justice. Like if you think about most civil courtrooms, poor people don't have lawyers at all. And so their cases aren't litigated in ways that you would expect good outcomes for them. And that's one of the ways in which structural inequities become perpetuated, and that can have a disproportionate impact on communities of color, right? When you think of who gets hauled into family court on a accusation of neglect, or who is faced with an eviction notice, like those are disproportionately people of color in most courthouses in America. And so there's that big structural problem. Like, we don't give those people lawyers. Those courtrooms, judges spend like 2 minutes per case, if that. It's not courtrooms where we're seeing a ton of justice in many instances. But then you have other ways in which our society has tried to protect people of color by passing legislation that would help people of color. And we see courts actually limit those protections for people of color. So let's take the Voting Rights Act. In a case called Shelby County versus Holder, the Supreme Court really weakened the provisions that were offered by the 1965 Voting Rights Act, that kept the point of that statute was to keep states from discriminating against people of color. So that's one example of where we've seen courts actually reach in and try to take away protections for people of color. There's this doctrine in employment discrimination law that's called the stray remarks doctrine, that makes it harder for people of color to prove employment discrimination based on racial slurs or remarks that were said just once, even if they can show some negative thing happened to them, like they lost their job. And so that's another doctrine that was created wholly by courts to limit protections for people of color that allows racial discrimination to continue. If you think of the qualified immunity doctrine that we hear so much about in police brutality cases, that doctrine was created in response to a very old statute that was originally referred to as the Ku Klux Klan Act, that was supposed to protect people of color, that we now is codified in 1983, that was supposed to protect people from state actors violating their civil rights, but we often see used against police who brutalize people of color or any group. Now you cannot prevail in a 1983 case against a police officer unless you can prove that the exact same thing happened in another case. So the police officer should have known they weren't allowed to do it. So they can violate their own internal policies. They can even violate the law and still not be sued successfully under 1983. And again, this was a statute that was originally designed to protect people of color. There's similar doctrines in housing discrimination cases. And so there's just all these places where we've seen these efforts by legislatures to protect people of color just been eviscerated by courts in ways that, really have been damaging.
Well, and I also appreciate I see the three, and this is the third interview we've done. The first two were, one was on police testimony and prosecutorial conduct. And I think that this kind of closes the circle on the systemic racism loop, in that you have police who are enforcing the laws that judges create and prosecutors who are prosecuting the cases the police bring them. So at every juncture, at every link in that circle, you have a vested interest in protecting the others. And I see that as one of the main purposes of this article. And if you could talk a little bit more about how those three agencies all work in tandem, even though each one is supposed to be doing, protecting the community from harm and whatnot.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think it's very clear that police and prosecutors work very closely together. Like if you think about, just our popular culture around the criminal legal system, and you think about like law and order, and there's like two sides of the criminal legal system, police and prosecutors, right? That's like the best act of, government propaganda ever created in modern TV history, for sure. It leaves out the defense in courts, right? Completely. It's amazing. So I think we kind of expect those two groups to work together. Police are one of the most well-funded government agencies in every city in the United States. And there are several police departments in the United States that have budgets of over $1 billion. I mean, just these huge, big machines capable of really influencing so much of our daily lives. So, of course, prosecutors are happy to work with this incredibly well-funded organization where, they're both supposedly fighting crime and protecting people. But as we know, unfortunately, police actually they don't just protect people. And in fact, arguably, police don't prevent crime. They maybe respond to crime, but some of the more proactive policing that police engage in can really harm communities. You see some communities that are basically occupied by police forces, right? They're just like vigilant people will literally walk by police and raise their shirts to show that they don't have anything in their waistband, because they've been so conditioned by years of this kind of occupation of their community that they'd rather just do that and get it over with, rather than risk being stopped and frisked and going through that, indignity. Okay, so that's my piece on how closely they work together. But we'd all like to think that judges have no part in that that's completely distinct from the business of law enforcement, and that judges are just there to like make legal rulings. But unfortunately, so many judges are former prosecutors that it's really difficult for them to lose that perspective about what crime fighting looks like, or about safety. And a lot of judges are elected rather than appointed. And so they have to run for election every several years. So they kind of have it's required that they have a campaign. And so what else can a judge campaign on other than their like tough on crime credentials? And so often it's that their history as a prosecutor, and it's the tough sentences they're handing out. It's those convictions that they're winning, even though they're supposed to be these neutral, detached parties. But you see that all over the country. If you think about like the ads you've seen for judges, it's not, it's not this neutral thing. Now, nobody's pro-crime, nobody is like, well, I'm going to run on a soft on crime credentials. But that's often what we think about when in fact we know, for example, that prosecuting people for misdemeanor offenses actually increases crime because they now have criminal records. They can't go out and get jobs. They're saddled. They've gone through this public experience of being prosecuted, and it makes it really hard to move on and be a successful contributing member of society after that. So there's all sorts of ways in which that actually what judges and prosecutors do isn't tied to public safety and in fact harms public safety. But unfortunately, we're just stuck in this like loop of just relying on the same things to make us all feel safe.
Well, yeah, and the point is brought home really clearly in the article too, because you point out that the majority of people who are trapped in the system, as you kind of just illustrated, are people of color, poor people. They have more contact with the police. They have less contact with lawyers who can defend them, and therefore more contact with prosecutors, and then judges who value prosecutors and police over them. And there's this kind of loop, and there's a section in the article where you say there's no fixing this. So I'd kind of like to wrap it up with, what do we do, and what do you think is if there's a solution, how do we begin to enact it, and how do we?
Yeah, it's really hard, and I think about this a lot because we're really seeing people almost regress in terms of crime, like going back to the things we did in the 80s and 90s that we know didn't work and got us to this point of mass incarceration, and spending, just oodles of money on police and prisons and all of these things. So what do I think would actually help? It's not popular, the things I'm going to suggest, but I think the things that would really impact public safety are not making sure that there aren't poor people. I think a lot of the crimes that we see, especially in my courthouse, I mean, the vast majority of crimes that are prosecuted are misdemeanors, and most of those are nonviolent. So when you think about like drug offenses, crimes of desperation, like shoplifting, one of the last trials I had before the pandemic was a case where someone was accused of stealing a bag of oranges and soap. I mean, right, like that actually, we did not help the community by prosecuting that case. We don't help make us safe by prosecuting people for drug offenses. Getting people drug treatment does. Helping them have the supports in place that would make people be successful would do far more for public safety than this cycle that we're in now of like arrest, prosecute, incarcerate, that doesn't actually encourage safety. When I think about like things that would like keep us safe, they're things like what you're doing, like libraries, right? Having places for people to go and let people do things, like having, nights at movie theaters and bowling alleys and ice skating rinks, so that kids were doing that instead of getting into trouble, so that people who need help know where to find it, like substance abuse and therapy treatment, and that they could afford it. I think those things would go a long way in making us safe, and that courts would be, places of last resort.
And so much of it seems to be fine driven, and if not fine, then incarceration. There's very little help. It's all carceral, and it's all punitive, and it's all
very punitive. Yeah, we're a very punitive country, unfortunately. There's far more sticks than carrots around here. And the few times that we have, the carrots, things like the child tax credit, that was the thing that could have kept us safe. It was taken away from us. Things that really support families, that keep people from being hungry, from being embarrassed in their neighborhoods. Those are the things I think that would keep us safe. Unfortunately, I don't think it's policing or courthouses.
right. And unfortunately, it doesn't look like it's going to go very far to dismantling. We're not going to get very far in dismantling that anytime soon.
I agree. And in fact, we just export it around the world. I mean, we're just, telling everyone you should do this, even though these other countries are safer, have better social safety nets, they're all kind of emulating us, even though it clearly doesn't work. We have very high crime despite doing this cycle of arrest, prosecute, incarcerate for decades. We have higher crime than these countries that actually, support families and individuals. Yeah, it's grim, but there's good things in the world, and like libraries and schools, places where people can really dream and think of these ideas and ways to make things better.